Warm greetings from the Center for National Security Studies. I'm your host, Balasubramanian, Senior Research Officer and Head of the Strategic Studies Program at CNSS. Today, we are in a conversation with our distinguished guest, Dr. Andrew Carr. Dr. Andrew is an Associate Professor of Defense of Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University, an award-winning teacher and scholar. His primary focus lies in strategy, Australian foreign and defense policy, including Middle Path theory and Asian security. He is also currently a member of the Australian National University Defense Strategic Policy History Project, writing a history of Australian defense white papers from 1976 to 2020. Thank you very much, sir, for taking time to be with us.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
So, without much further delay, let me start by asking the first question. It's an interesting policy paper that you have put out, which I have read, where you, in your policy brief, you argue that net assessment are critical for Australia to navigate in today's global disorder. Could you please explain what net assessment are and why they are particularly relevant for the present times?
Yeah, thank you, Bella. So we've always had a very clear need to kind of understand the adversary's capability. You know, if you can go all the way back to the Sun Tzu with his famous statement, know your enemy and know yourself, and never in 1,000 battles will you lose. And we find similar kind of statements amongst all of the great kind of strategic analysts throughout history. The practice of net assessment, as formally understood, is a Cold War creation from the United States. Particularly in 1973, the US Office of the Pentagon set up an Office of Net Assessment, and it was led by a man named Andy Marshall, who ran it until 2015. Net assessments are an attempt at a kind of comprehensive or holistic assessment of a particular problem or a particular balance of power. And what they're kind of trying to do is say, let's move away from thinking about having a singular grand strategy that knits everything together, and instead better understand the specific problems that we might need to deal with, the dynamics that make those problems so difficult, the key trends, particularly at looking at how might conflicts play out in particular scenarios, and then understanding those situations as well from how the adversary is pursuing them. And can we find ways to find advantage, particularly enduring long-term advantages that we can exploit for our kind of benefit over the long term? So what does that look like in practice? Well, we know from kind of what the US has revealed about their long-standing practice of net assessments, as well as some of the kind of net assessment offices that we've seen set up around the world in India, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, in Japan. They'll look at work such as, you know, the US-Soviet military maritime balance in the Atlantic. There were US net assessments on the global nuclear balance or on the European theatre balance. And a big kind of aim of those comprehensive assessments, particularly strongly pushed by Andy Marshall, was, you know, going beyond just looking at the raw numbers of how many tanks does each side have or the munitions capacities, and really asking, you know, how does the other side think about that balance of power? And what are the organizational, political, or strategic factors that drive their behavior? You know, how capable would they be if we had to fight? And what are the holes or the problems in their approach which we could potentially exploit? And so it made great sense in the Cold War, in that kind of real competitive situation between the US and the Soviet Union. And it disappeared from kind of primary attention for quite a bit of the early 2000s and that post-Cold War period. But we're seeing a number of countries start to kind of re-energize or adopt it, as in Australia's case, in 2023. And so in the paper, Net Assessments for Australia, I kind of outline and try and explain what net assessments are, because it's quite a new practice here in Australia, and I think a very useful one. Also try to say that it shouldn't just be within our Department of Defence, that there's actually a great value in using net assessments for foreign policy issues, so the broader balance of power in different key theatres, for looking at technological developments such as AI or non-kinetic threats to the nation, at economic security issues, and particularly for Australia, one of the big questions we're looking at, which is the question of deterrence. And I think it's a really good framework for trying to get into some of those questions and attempt to try and solve some of those strategic problems. So the kind of very short answer at the end of this, to wrap it up, is net assessments are a problem-solving tool. If you're in a competition, why is the adversary acting as they are? And how do you win that competition? By really understanding what's motivating them and what their true capacity is.
Thank you. We have lucidly brought out the US contribution to net assessment, including you have mentioned the comprehensive assessment. Let me ask you, speaking of assessment, today strategic imagination is very critical for a rising power like India. How do you think can the net assessment approach you propose inspire policymakers to develop innovative strategy to address, challenges like border tensions or for that matter even maritime security in the Indian Ocean region?
Yeah, look, thank you for that question. So, strategic imagination is a concept that I actually was able just to put out a book on recently, and it was proposed by a late colleague of mine, Professor Brendan Sargent, who was a senior Australian defence official at the very highest levels and then became a scholar on defence policy issues, and unfortunately recently passed away. But there's a great book online now that he can about his work that you hopefully can get into. And his idea of strategic imagination was a reflection that the people, the culture, the traditions, the institutions of a country give us a sense of kind of what the realm of the viable is. Well, when we look at a strategic problem, we try to fit it into that past. And how do we think about these problems? And what are the types of solutions that we often lead towards? And he said, look, when you're at times of systemic change, as we potentially are at this moment, we need to understand what the contours of a national strategic imagination are, because they might be obscuring some of the solutions, some of the pathways through some of these crises that we face. And so having a kind of really clear understanding of it, of how we've traditionally passed it and how appropriate that is for our future challenges, I think is a really useful insight. And so that's one he pushed. And, he was a great scholar of India, kind of spent a lot of time visiting and writing about the place, and was kind of drew a lot of attention from some of the great kind of Indian histories and kind of, questions about living on the border he often found really fascinating. And that's something I think kind of really resonates there with the Indian community. In terms of kind of net assessments, they would almost sit at the other end of the spectrum in terms of trying to be quite a, almost reductionist, focusing on very particular problems. And I think strategic imagination helps you say, well, are you understanding the contours of this problem clearly? And then once you've identified, what are those core problems, how do you then kind of burrow down into it, finding ways that you can actually get a solution or find some way past that? And so for policymakers, I think there's two real benefits. First, that net assessments are designed to serve the senior leadership of a country. So it's very much, what is the most important problems to them? It's not just looking at an issue in terms of its day-to-day management or as a longer-term issue, but kind of really tailoring advice to serve the needs of national leaders, which is something that doesn't always happen in that translation between kind of the institutions and the elected officials, as much as everyone tries to make it happen that way. And second, kind of then taking an issue, and so, for instance, you might look at, say, the border tension between India and China and saying, well, what is the core of those disputes? What are the kind of really kind of nub of those issues? What's the capacity, the intent, the organizational patterns on every issue? And I think one strength of net assessments is they push us to go beyond saying China believes this or India does that, as if these are holistic, clear actors that only have a singular purpose or focus, when, we all know that there are messy bureaucratic politics and compromise and cultures and habits and traditions and errors and mistakes and resource limitations that all play into how countries actually engage with each other. And so trying to chart and understand some of those different tensions and then saying, well, what are the factors here that are enduring, that might create advantages or that might reflect our weaknesses, and what might we then attempt to overcome them? Net assessments historically have tried to stay on the diagnostic side, which is understanding that problem rather than necessarily proposing, well, you need to go and buy this military capability or invest in that particular diplomatic solution. There's a kind of caution about the overlap or biasing towards particular solutions, but very much that if we really understand the problem, then maybe we can make meaningful progress on them, and ideally the problems that matter most to the senior leadership of the country.
I really appreciate that nomenclature which you use, a diagnostic problem. Bringing your attention back to the policy brief, you recommend establishing dedicated net assessment directorates in multiple government departments, including defense, foreign affairs, home affairs, treasury, and including the Prime Minister's office. What specific strategic problem do you think these directorates could help address, and how do you think they could improve or they would improve decision making?
Thank you. So in 2023, Australia set up a division of net assessment inside its Department of Defence. And the core purpose was to say, well, we used to have a balanced force in the Australian Defence Force that could do lots of different things, but now we need a focused force that in a couple of key scenarios we know can be effective. So net assessments were used as a way to help design the forces that are to come in the future and to think through some of those scenarios in great depth and detail, and then shape capability planning and choices. I think that's a really good start. It's a really important kind of innovation, and it's a big sign of how governments around the region are shifting in their thinking about, well, what's really important at the moment. But I've written this paper saying that I think that can and should be expanded on two ways. First, within the Department of Defence, I think we need to see much more movement towards, that kind of classic red versus blue military analysis. And so not only, using intelligence to say, well, what is the capacity of different countries around the region, of North Korea or of China or of Russia, but also looking at, what is the capacity of our partners and friends as well. When we look at some of the disruption to the United States at the moment, how's that affecting their military capacity, their organizational structures, their efficiency, their effectiveness, their command structures? What about Japan in terms of if the US is stepping back, how much can Japan actually play that role as a military power? How are they adapting that significant adjustments we're seeing in terms of their military capacity? How efficiently and effectively are they doing that, and the strengths and weaknesses of that? And those are difficult questions to do, talking openly about our allies and partners. But I think if we're thinking that we're going to be in a conflict scenario in a medium to long term, and hopefully we can avoid that, we do need to have a real clear sense of that issue. The second area where I think net assessments could be usefully expanded is that while the departments around in Australia are very good at some of the kind of day-to-day tactical problem solving, there's often not a very clear sense of, well, how do we stop this from being a problem again tomorrow? And how do we try to kind of organize the efforts of the department that is trying to do so many different things? And, it's just overwhelming what current policymakers face, and prioritize those issues that are most important at the moment and make meaningful progress on them. Because there's been a long tendency of, as the world has gotten more complex and more confusing, we want to produce these big framework documents, these kind of white papers and kind of grand strategic style documents to kind of integrate everything. And that has its place, but I think it's come at the expense of kind of making meaningful progress on the issues that matter most. So to give two examples, in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I think it'd be very useful for them to really help Australia to understand what is the regional balance of power. But this is something that Australia hasn't always had to know a lot about, given our safety and our security, particularly over the last half century. But it's really crucial that we understand what is the balance of power in our region if Australia is to achieve its goal of a regional balance of power that enables the sovereign choice of other nations in our region. That's what Australia is seeking, to preserve sovereignty of other countries in the region, and a balance of power that enables that. So to do that, you need to actually have a very finely grained and set understanding of, well, what is that balance of power and how do other countries see it, so that you can then start to adapt your policy choices to kind of effectively shape and influence it. And particularly for a smaller country like Australia, we need to have that really kind of fine-grained analysis. Well, the other one I was going to say is that I think, Australia's moved towards a policy of deterrence by denial, particularly aimed at China, although, other countries kind of could be kind of a focus there, such as North Korea and Russia. But putting in a deterrence policy, which is, again, very new for Australia, is a great challenge. And thus far, a lot of our debates have been about military capability, acquiring long-range strike options or submarines. And that's crucial. But deterrence, as you'd know really well, Bala, is not just the kind of capacity you have, but it's also the communications you put out to the world, and it's the credibility of those communications and those statements by government. And so I think to see the Prime Minister kind of claim that space of deterrence and their necessary leadership role, net assessments could be a very good way for helping them understand what's involved in this very different type of defence strategy for Australia and how to actually implement it and ensure it's led at the highest levels. So that's kind of the areas where I think it could be usefully expanded.
Speaking of disruptions, US and others, you reference Andrew Marshall's work with the US Office of Net Assessment, particularly his focus on exploiting asymmetries against adversaries like the then Soviet Union. How do you think can this approach be employed to modern challenges such as competition with China? Because it's more like I am invited to think from this perspective because India also faces a lot of diverse threat from conventional military risks to non-traditional challenges. How do you think can this approach help India to integrate all these factors into a cohesive national security framework? Balancing immediate with long-term policy priorities. Your take on this, please.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there is a great value in Andy Marshall's framework applied to today. We need to be very kind of careful about what the strategic logic is when we do net assessments, and that's a challenge of applying it from countries like the US to an Australian context. Probably India is a bit more close to the US kind of context in terms of a much more direct one-to-one peer competition with a nation like China. I mean, Australia's just in a different league in that way. What Marshall always pushed was this idea of kind of an underlying strategic logic. How do you actually try to win that competition? Australia can't win a competition against China on its own, but as part of a larger coalition, we can certainly understand where those opportunities can be and to apply our shoulder to the wheel in the right kind of part and place. Whereas I think India could more directly adopt the Andy Marshall style, updated for the 21st century and the kind of, very strong desire to deter conflict and to keep it as a competition, which Marshall embraced. When thinking about this, I do find it really strange that our debates across the world kind of tend to move towards one of two poles, that either that we look at China and some people say, it's this 10-foot tall monster, we've never seen a historic threat like this, and they're all these kind of long-term strategic thinkers who have everything planned out. And then on the other side, there are those who kind of claim that China is about to implode at any moment and is a fundamentally weak country, and we almost don't need to worry. And when people kind of write about Xi Jinping, there's often this sense, he can just do whatever he wants within China. That any Chinese policy is obviously his decision and his kind of direction, and that everything is moving according to his policy and plans. And I think net assessments are a useful way of trying to get beyond some of those crude dichotomies and those crude kind of pictures. From my kind of reading of the net assessment literature of the Cold War history and then applying kind of some of those insights to China, you say that, for all of Xi Jinping's dominance, there are many organizational, historical, or cultural reasons why he's unable to get his way on every single issue. And we do see the PLA conducting many actions that are very strategically wise and rational, but there are also some things that they do that aren't as strategically rational, effective, or efficient. And so I think if we're going to be in a competitive situation, we need to actually understand the other side as they actually are. So we go into that competition. What are the details? Not only why they're acting as they're doing, acting as they're doing at a granular level, but how do they interpret our actions as well? And then how do we use that information to try and compete more effectively, to push competition to areas where we have a strength in or they are particularly weak? So one example that I like to use when I talk about this publicly is from the Reagan administration in the 1980s, where it realized that it was very strong on missile technology and particularly kind of space-based technology, the infamous Star Wars program that Ronald Reagan pushed. And it realized that it could push the Soviet Union into a competition about building advanced missile defense technology, that the Soviet Union kind of faced this heads I wins, tails you lose kind of dichotomy, right? That either they tried to compete with the US and went bankrupt and had to move lots of resources away from domestic levels, which is what happened, or if they had chosen not to compete, they would have been humiliated. They would have kind of demonstrated their weakness internationally, and the USA would have still gotten ahead with a much greater technological advance. So the central point is, I think, if you're in a competition, we need to think of it as a competition. How do we win the thing, right? Not just to try and manage it and kind of mitigate it our way through.
Taking cue from what you just mentioned in your response, strategic logic In your policy brief, you emphasize assessing both adversaries and allies as well to identify strategic asymmetry. Here, how do you think a net assessment enhance partnership or bilateral ties, but at the same time also addressing potential vulnerabilities in the relationship? Because the fix here is, however, given the sensitive nature of assessing both adversaries as well as friendly countries, don't you think or reason that there also needs to be a balance for comprehensive net assessment with managing as well as maintaining diplomatic relationship, particularly partners like the Australia, the US, or partners like Japan, because India, Australia, we are all part of also Quad partners. So how do you deal with this?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. And it's something that as we start moving into kind of the sharper end of some of these coalition dynamics, we're really going to have to start to think through, because it's not just enough that we all say we want to kind of cooperate in the areas that it's comfortable to do so, but we're going to have to be able to say, well, where are the shortfalls from each country so that, ideally someone else can help pick up the slack in different areas, or just to understand the relative strengths and weaknesses of each other so that we can best cooperate in the areas that we have to, rather than just the areas where it's kind of comfortable or kind of useful to do so. So there is a kind of difficult element to that. How do we look clearly not only at our friends and partner countries, but a real great challenge of net assessment as a work is also looking internally. Understanding your own country's capacities. And that's often very hard for a military or a government to do, to kind of recognize the weaknesses of its own capacity and how it might start to make changes about that long term. There's very obvious kind of sensitivities of that. But I think this is an area where we could potentially start to get, our analysts working together, and the sharing of those different assessments would be really valuable. But, it's not just enough for Australia to say, this is the regional balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, if we don't understand how Indian analysts and Indian leaders see the regional balance of power. So that sharing of that at that kind of granular level, I think is really important. And our intelligence agencies do that a bit, but I'd like to see kind of more of it from there. And then that enables us, if we kind of need to work together. So, if we're dealing with, say, a non-traditional security threat in the Indian Ocean, or a collective challenge, such as, say, Chinese maritime power, how could we then start to better understand what are the key dynamics that are driving these issues, and what are the types of investments that India and Australia can make collectively that play to our respective strengths, that play to our respective asymmetries, that overall can provide some of that advantage, so that we're not just each trying to redo this problem anew, but we're actually kind of recognizing where are those kind of competitive asymmetries for that. And so I think that's really important. And then the other part is, bringing that wider recognition of, how do countries, particularly some of the smaller countries, but that have really important roles, your Malaysias, your Indonesia, your Thailand, your Sri Lankas, how do they think about, say, the balance of power within the Indian Ocean? Because that's a really kind of crucial for their long-term choices and behaviors as they kind of play through. So I think those are kind of really important dynamics for our analysts to work on, and hopefully kind of part of some of those larger Quad conversations going forward.
If I may indulge you, speaking of Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific, as we speak, we just had the 11th iteration of the Talisman Sabre 2025, the largest exercise which Australia just conducted. 19 nations with 35,000 forces, which began in Australia. How do you look at it? Can I request some first-hand inputs from your side? Because I know China is watching these very, very closely. We had concerns regarding Chinese activities in the South Pacific Islands, etc., where Australia was also. So there's a lot of common concern between the Quad partners, especially India, Australia. So can you please share your first-hand inputs on that?
Thank you. Yeah, no, look, it was great to see the Talisman Sabre kind of wrapping up another very successful year and a very kind of large contribution for it. I mean, I think there's two ways to think about these. At a kind of tactical or operational level, they're incredibly valuable. Just that ability to train, to engage, to work together, to improve all of our basic skills, to share that knowledge, to just understand, well, why do you operate in the way that each side, particularly each kind of nation, likes to do so. And I think that has often a really underappreciated value, just how difficult genuine modern military operations are, and the value of really good experience and really great development. If you look at how did the US go from Vietnam to the first Gulf War, that radical improvement in its military capacity, a big reason is that they actually improved a lot of their training efforts, particularly, say, in the Air Force with the Red Flag Initiative. And so I think we really underappreciate in some ways just how valuable that is at a tactical and operational level. As outsiders kind of looking in, the military understand it, but we're picking it up. The other question is the kind of strategic one. Does this send particular signals? Does this shape or influence the longer term dynamics? There, I tend to be a bit more cautious. I think defense diplomacy has its role, but I think it kind of mainly operates at that tactical or an operational level for the practices of it, and that's valuable in itself. My own sense is that country leaders see this as useful, but they will still do what they want to do when, say, a future crisis comes. So I don't think any of the 19 nations who participate in Talisman Sabre would consider themselves locked into contributing in this way. And I think while China will, certainly see that as hopefully a strong sign of regional concern and the capacity of regional countries, it's unlikely that they will be kind of saying, oh, well, we obviously can't conduct, potential future military operations because of this. But, the more that you can demonstrate that tactical competence, the more that that's going to feed back to their decision making about, well, could we actually succeed in the particular operations that they're looking to do so? And so I think that's actually incredibly valuable, far more than perhaps these higher level strategic signals. That demonstration of basic military competence and effectiveness and cohesion at a tactical and operational level has a great value all of itself. How do we kind of deny them that sense that they could achieve their objectives long term by demonstrating our capacity to do so in other theaters and our willingness to cooperate in that way? So I think it's a great initiative at that level, as long as we kind of tamp down some of the overall statements that sometimes pop out about them.
In terms of demonstrating capability, my next question is on, if you look at it, any strategic landscape, it requires a deft balancing of regional influence coupled with global ambitions also. How do you think a structured yet a creative approach of net assessment help craft forward-looking policy in terms of navigating great power competition and the emerging global disorder in the present context?
Yeah, thank you. It's a fascinating question. I mean, my view is that strategy at heart is about prioritization. If you can't focus attention and resources on what matters most, you're probably not being strategic. And that's something that I think Australia has struggled with for a while, because in the very peaceful post-Cold War era, we were able to kind of follow issues around the world, and that kind of bouncing ball of whatever was the big issue of the day, we were able to contribute, and we liked to contribute. It was kind of in our national culture that we saw this as a good thing and a valuable thing to do. So I think net assessments are hopefully a useful way for countries to say, well, what are the 2 or 3 priorities for the national leader, the head of state, or for the key ministers or their most senior level officials? What are the most important problems for them that they were democratically elected to solve in the national security space? And then tasking officials and analysts and giving them the space and time to really go away and interrogate that, to provide that comprehensive longer term picture of the key dynamics and of where, and diagnosing where can action be taken. So I think that's incredibly valuable work that, by the nature of just day-to-day policy churn and issues and political leaders kind of initiatives and policies, it's just not work that's always done, not through lack of capacity, but it's often just not what the system is set up to do. So I think net assessments allow that prioritization and that problem solving. I think a second benefit of net assessments is, helping to focus our attention on, what are the actions that we can take over that medium to longer term. So slightly trying to push out our time horizons a little bit. We can't solve some of these bigger problems overnight, but what actions can we take today that would set us up into a much better picture in 5 to 8 years' time? What are the really big and difficult choices that we're going to have to make, including some of the sacrifices we're going to have to make to actually try and resolve some of these problems? And I think, an interesting example of some of that at the moment we're seeing is in the United States system with Elbridge Colby, who, whatever you think of him, he's putting in public some of these very big questions, very difficult questions, but they're very important questions about, what are you doing long term? Where are you going to put your defense spending? What are your kind of future commitments going to be? And governments don't want to answer that, but if we're going to do this properly, we do need to have some sense of how these might go and confront those questions. Even if you reserve the final decision to the leaders at the time, you do need to still work through the questions today, as uncomfortable as they are. I think a third benefit of the net assessment approach is that, it helps us to kind of think about competition, not as something simply to manage, but how do we be proactive and attempt to actually win it? And that's not just at a global level, but at a kind of theater by theater, issue by issue. So China and India on the border, or China and Australia in the South Pacific. Very different dynamics in some ways, but in both of them, our countries are looking not just to kind of mitigate the harm, but to kind of change the longer term environment so that it's actually more favorable to our interests. I think that partly starts with recognizing that our adversaries have problems too. So how do we try to create more of those problems? How do we exploit them? How do we kind of position ourselves to take away some of their strengths in these competitions, as they've been so effective at doing towards us? To kind of sum up this somewhat long-winded answer, there's that old joke, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. And so I think we've spent a lot of time trying to just think about just how big the size of this task is, and it's probably stopped us from chewing. So I think we need to work out, what are the areas that we need to tackle first, those that perhaps can help us longer term, and kind of get to work. That's really what good strategy involves. It's problem solving. Net assessments are a proven tool for analyzing those problems so we can proceed to kind of solving them. So, time to get chewing, I think, Bala.
My last question, Dr. Andrew, is today, looking at positioning India-Australia ties, if I may use the word, it has moved beyond the hesitations, because there are a lot of, between India and Australia, a lot of complementary strength, a lot of strategic alignment, as well as today, we also see a very robust economic cooperation also. So how do you think can this India-Australia ties actually contribute towards regional stability and addressing shared concerns?
Yeah, thank you. At a military level, I think, Australia, Indonesia, and India are kind of the fundamental countries for the kind of northwestern part of the Indian Ocean. And so the degree to which we can have a similar view of kind of the correct rules of the road and how we approach and cooperate in that region will be absolutely crucial for longer term stability, and perhaps understanding how, some of the conflict scenarios in the Middle East or in the Northeast Asia might play out and influence our homeland. So I think that is a really crucial areas of very direct and meaningful cooperation between Australia and India there. I think at a larger scale, there will be similarities and there will be differences, and learning how we can kind of learn from each other about managing that. I think Australia has often been seen as this country that just did whatever the US told it to do historically. And I think rhetorically, we've sometimes played that up. The history is actually quite different. I think the history is that Australians actually have quite a distinct sense of their own strategic interests that they pursue somewhat independently from that. And almost we're seeing the reverse with India, that there is that long tradition of non-alignment and being seen to be very kind of distinct and on your own, but you actually have a long history of working with others and cooperating and kind of finding a way to go along less. So we're coming at this from quite different directions, but it's probably actually a very useful marriage in that sense of two countries that have these distinctive strategic imaginations, how we like to think of ourselves and our approaches, but we're having to evolve past them in order to deal with the kind of issues that we're confronting today. So I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. And, whatever happens with Trump or Taiwan over the next 5, 10, 15 years, we're still going to be neighbors. We're still going to have to learn how to live it to each other, and we're still going to keep evolving in different directions. So there's obviously a great value in that. And I think that's why it's great to see some of the investments that both countries are putting into that relationship. And hopefully through the Quad and other forums, we can see that even extended further.
Thank you, Dr. Andrew. There are a lot of key takeaways for our audience, starting from you just beautifully explained how net assessment is a code for creation, including US contribution to net assessment, comprehensive assessment. We discussed about strategic imagination and how it includes people, culture, and traditions of a particular country. And you also brought up this concept of strategic logic, which includes, partners. So that really brings us to the end of today's episode. A big thank you to our guest, Dr. Andrew Carr, for spending time with us and offering such invaluable insights. To our audience, I really hope you found our discussion insightful and thought provoking. Thank you for tuning in and being a part of this conversation. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew. It was really a pleasure having you with us, and we would love to have more such conversations with you. Thank you so much, and a sincere gratitude, and wishing you all the best in all your future endeavors.
My absolute pleasure. Keep up the great work with the podcast.
Thank you.